All right, good evening. All right, for tonight's video, Emancipation, I made a handout, and that's in the Unit 4 folder on Blackboard. Okay, so just go through that with your study guide. So we're going to talk about financing the war, and then we're going to jump down and do behind the front lines. And then when we meet in class, that'll basically mean we just have to finish the military part of the war and then do reconstruction. So we're going to start with financing the war. Which one? Go. All right. So basically, the Union and the Confederacy had the same options to pay for the war. Taxes, bonds, and printing money. Okay. Both of them had those options. Right? And it worked better for the Union than it did for the Confederacy. But let me start with the Confederacy with regards to these three ways. So, Confederate States of America. Let's start with taxes. Taxes were not popular in the Confederacy. Remember, the Confederacy is real big about states' rights. And so a federal tax ain't going to be popular to people who are committed to states' rights. Enforcement was spotty in terms of having tax collectors who could go out and collect the tax. Again, there's only about 5 million white people in the Confederacy. And when you take out children and women and what's needed to fight the war, it doesn't leave you with a whole lot. And so a lot of people just didn't pay the taxes. They just didn't pay them. So that's pretty much a failure. I don't even have a number here. It's such a failure. Yeah. Let's talk about bonds. Bonds, in case you've forgotten from Unit 2, bonds are basically money that you give to the government. Remember Alexander Hamilton's treasury bonds back in Unit 2. You give money to the government gives you a bond. When the bond matures, you get your money back plus the interest. Bonds did not sell very well. Even the first round of bonds only sold about 15 million, and they never really did much better than that. Of course, the big problem with buying a bond is that if the Confederacy fails, your bond is worthless. And so that made it very hard to sell the bonds overseas to any European countries, especially as the war started to turn against the Confederacy in 1863. That left the printing press. And so the Confederacy simply started printing money. I have some numbers here. 1861, 119 million was printed. 1862, another 400 million was printed. Don't get caught up on these numbers, okay? Just be familiar with the options and why the options failed, but don't try to memorize all these numbers. This led to a bit of an inflation problem, as you can imagine. In 1861, let's say something that cost $1 in 1861, by 1864, now cost $46. And by 1865, would cost $92. So you think inflation's bad these days. Wow, be glad you did not live in the Confederacy. That should be 1865, during the early 1860s. So yeah, the money situation for the Confederacy was something they were never able to really get a hold of. Again, people did not pay taxes. Enforcement was erratic. Bonds never really took off in sales. And so that left the Confederacy with really no other choice but to print money. And that led to an inflation problem. Cotton did continue to flow out of the Confederacy, mainly across the Rio Grande into Mexico, but there was never going to be enough cotton. I mean, you can imagine the trouble of trying to ship all the cotton to South Texas so you could sell it to Mexico. There was just no way that was going to be an efficient way to raise money. Let's talk about the Union. Now, the Union also had some problems when it came to paying for the war. There had been a depression in 1857 that had hurt the economy. And then there had been what is now called the recession in 1861, which had further damaged the Union economy. In addition to that was the legacy of Andrew Jackson's bank war, because now there were 7,000 different kinds of banknotes in circulation at this point. And so these were a lot of problems that needed to be tackled if the Union was going to successfully prosecute the war. In terms of, let's start with bonds. Pretty well. About 1.5 billion in bonds was sold, so pretty good. Also, if you were a bank, you had to place yourself under the Treasury Department. And what that allowed the Lincoln administration to do was to start getting rid of these multiple banknote in circulation. So if you were a bank that had been printing your own banknotes, you had to stop doing that. And you had to pull as much of your banknotes out of circulation as you could and inform other banks that you were pulling out as well. It's not an overnight thing, to be certain, but it did begin cleaning up this 7,000 different kinds of banknotes nonsense. And about 2/3 of all Union banks would eventually sign up for this deal. All right, because they wanted to be able to sell bonds because it was very lucrative for them to do so. There are also taxes. The Union also had an income tax, what we would call sin taxes. So taxes on alcohol, taxes on tobacco, what we would call a luxury tax. So things like yachts or billiard tables also were taxed as well. Enforcement was more robust than in the Confederacy, to be sure. And then finally, the Union, like the Confederacy, turned on the printing press. In 1862, the Union printed up about 400 million of what were called greenbacks. Well, not 400, 400 billion greenbacks. These became legal tender, so they had to be accepted as money by the banks, by the government. Pretty much everybody accepted them as legal money. But even with all this, the Union does not experience runaway inflation. Why? And I touched on this in class. California gold. Because of California's gold, the Union is not going to experience the inflationary problems that the Confederacy experienced. And I told you that story that Lincoln hoped one day, once he had retired, that he would be able to travel to California and see the gold mines that, in his words, had helped pay for the war. So that's a real brief financing of the war. If this is something you want to go dig deeper in, I can certainly recommend books. One that came out just a couple of years ago that examined this entire thing in the Union. I'll be more than happy to pass that along. I want to turn now to the behind the front lines section. Just very, very quickly. There were a lot of improvements, particularly in the Union, with regards to manufacturing and the rail and things like that. And I just want to sort of touch on those. You remember in Unit 3, I sort of listed all the ways in which the Union was outpacing the Confederacy. I talked about railroads and telegraph and canals and ports and all the other stuff. Those improvements are continuing during the war. And I just want to point some of them out because many of them will go beyond the war. First of all, agriculture. The Union, because so much of the farm labor was at war, this is when we began to see the mechanization of farming really taking off. And I misspelled that word. There we go. Mechanization of farming, particularly Cyrus McCormick's mechanical reaper, which is a machine that helps pick the crops. Still some version of that. Some crops do have to be picked by hand, but a lot of crops you can pick mechanically. And so the McCormick reaper. And in fact, here's a figure for you. In 1862 and 1863, the Union grew more wheat than it had in 1859, even though 1/3 of farm labor was in the Army. So even with 1/3 of the farm labor supply off at war, the Union Army, because of mechanization, grew more wheat in 1862 and 1863 than it had in 1859. So the mechanization of farming really playing a role here. And of course, women, of course, taking over farm work as well. I would be remiss if I did not, of course, mention the importance of women in agriculture. Rail transportation. A couple of big improvements here. Two, the construction of bridges improved with so much war material now being hauled. Bridges were having to carry heavier and heavier loads. And so the construction of bridges improved. And then second, the standardization of rail gauges. The rail gauge, for those of you who don't know, the gauge of rail is the width between the two rails. Okay. However, and I think it's like four feet, 4.5 feet, 4 3/4. I'm not sure what it is anymore. But before the Civil War, it was not standardized at all. And so you might have a train carrying a bunch of stuff, and then when you reach where the train rail changed, you had to unload everything into a different train. That is very time consuming and wasteful. So the government decided what is the most common one? It's 4 feet, 4.5, 4 3/4 feet. And the government said, that's it. And that became the standardized rail, not only for the Union, but for pretty much all of the Western Hemisphere. Canada, the US, Central America, Mexico, South America, that is the standard gauge for the Western Hemisphere. And so that is something the Civil War brought about. Food production. Mainly the canning of fruits, vegetables, meat, milk, things like that. This was not something that was very common, but the war brought it about. And of course, after the war, the canning of these things will continue. It's a lot easier to carry. A canned vegetable will keep for a much longer amount of time than if you're just carrying, vegetables or fruits. And so this is something that predates the war a little bit, but the war is really going to inject it. And of course, after the war, it will continue. And then finally, standardization. I already talked about standardization of rail gauges, so I don't need to go back to that. But the other thing that got standardized, particularly for men, were clothing sizes. The Union Army decided large, medium, small, we need to have like one standardized definition of what those words mean, because one manufacturer might have a different idea of what a medium-sized shirt is versus another manufacturer. You can't have that kind of chaos. So the Union Army, the quartermaster system said, this is a small, this is a medium, this is a large. They did the same thing for shoes as well. That was another thing where clothing sizes became standardized, at least for men, because of the needs of the war. All right. Now, Southern agriculture. Well, let's talk about Southern manufacturing first. Actually, we'll do Southern agriculture because I have the notes right here. Lots of problems. 2 shortages in Southern agriculture. Food crops was 1, salt to preserve meat. was the other. The war made these shortages worse. Two ways. One, slaves ran off. So the people who were actually doing a lot of this work up here simply split. And so your labor force dropped off. And two, the Union, particularly after 1863, began destroying Confederate railroads. And so it became much more difficult to move the food to where it needed to go. Right. And that's a problem. Both of these problems really took off in 1863. It would continue to be problems for the Confederacy all the way up until the end of the war. Confederate manufacturing had its own issues. There were two sort of broad areas where Confederate manufacturing had a problem. One was how can I put this? Advanced weaponry. Let me find some slides here real quick. Let me take a look here. Okay, this, I'll take all these slides, move them up here. Okay. This cannon here is the Napoleon. And it's a very simple cannon to build. It is essentially a bronze. It is sometimes called the 10-pounder, maybe the 12-pounder, but it's a very simple cannon, all right? And both sides can pretty much manufacture these, both the Union and the Confederacy. It's not terribly difficult to build these, all right? This is a slightly more advanced cannon. This one is a wrought iron. And so what you do here, hold on for a second. It's wrought iron. So what you do here is you have a mold, okay? And you pour the iron while it's hot into the mold. And then you put the two pieces together, and that's pretty much your cannon. This rounded piece back here, that's to keep the back of the cannon from blowing up, which is what happened the first time they tested it. It blew off the back end and killed 3 or 4 people. But again, both sides can build this particular weapon. Right? This is a weapon that only the Union was able to build. Get down there. Oh, hang on. This is cast iron. Okay, it's not important that you know these names, but this is cast iron. This is wrought iron. And instead of having a mold, you pounded the shape while the iron was still hot. You would have very specialized tools that would pound it into shape while it was still hot and malleable. So it's one solid piece. There are no pieces that you're putting together, which is what you're doing with particularly this one here. This is often called the 3-incher, and it could only be manufactured by the union. Now, you're probably wondering, what the hell kind of difference does this make? Okay, let me go back to here. So this is our Napoleon. This is bronze. I want you to picture in your mind a barn. The barn is 1 mile away. You will hit that barn with this weapon. You will not hit it in the same place twice unless you're lucky, but you will hit the barn with this weapon. And again, both sides can manufacture these. With our cast iron. Go back to the barn. Okay, the barn is 1 mile away. There's a door on the barn. I want you to see the barn door. You will hit the barn door every single time with this weapon. Okay, it is that accurate. Okay, so this one, you will hit the barn somewhere, but this one, you can hit that door on the barn every single time. This weapon is rifled. The artillery is rifled. So there's a groove that the shell follows when it comes off, much like a rifled weapon. Okay. Go back to your barn. Okay. The barn is now 2 miles away. Okay. See the door on the barn. Okay, use your big looking glass. You see the barn, you see the door on the barn. There is a window in the door of the barn. You will hit that window every single time with this weapon. That is how accurate it is. So you will hit the barn from a mile somewhere. You will hit the barn door from a mile. You will hit the window in the barn door from 2 miles. That's what I mean by advanced weaponry. And again, the Union was the only side capable of manufacturing these because of the special equipment needed to make them. The other thing is fuses. These are fuses for shells. We have not talked about shells yet, but we will next week. There were a type of shell whose name escapes me. Give me a second here. Shell shot. Shell shot is the one that you shoot it up in the air and it like explodes over the enemy's head, and then like shrapnel falls down on the enemy. And by the way, the person who invented shrapnel was Henry Shrapnel. That's his actual name. So you fire it, it blows up over the enemy's head. Well, in order to time where it's going to blow up at, you need fuses, and these are fuses. So if the enemy's really far away, you want to use the 15-second fuse, right? If the enemy's really close, you're on a 5-second fuse. Okay. What's the problem? The problem is that the Union had established standards for their fuses. And I think fuses may be spelled with an S. Well, it's spelled with a Z here. We'll go with their old timey. So a 12-second fuse manufactured in New York will work the same way as a 12-second fuse manufactured in Michigan or in Illinois. Okay, it's a standardized, we talked about standardization a few minutes ago. It is a standardized process to manufacture these. The Confederacy, their fuses were made more by, let's call it a mom and pop operation. So homemade fuses. So a 12-second fuse might blow up at the 5-second mark, and you might wind up raining shrapnel onto your own people, which is a bad thing. Or a 5-second fuse, the enemy's real close to you, you fire off a 5-second fuse, and that damn thing blows up at 15 seconds way behind the enemy. Okay. So again, there wasn't the sort of same standardization in manufacturing. So with Confederate fuses, you hoped they worked at the time that they said, but you really didn't know, unlike Unions, where they worked exactly the way they were supposed to. All right. So again, the advanced weaponry, the equipment needed for advanced weaponry, but also a standardized process for building something as simple as fuses. Okay, and these are the ways that the Confederacy was deficient in its manufacturing. All right, so that gets us through the financing the war and behind the front lines. Please be sure you go over to Blackboard and get the Emancipation handout that's in the Unit 4 folder. And I will see you on Monday, the 22nd, and we should be able to just finish the war in that one night. Yeah, we should be able to just finish on the 22nd. So be sure you're there. All right, and I'll see you then.